There is something unusual about certain historical records. Not unusual in a dramatic sense. Not the kind of unusual that makes headlines or triggers official investigations. It is quieter than that, more subtle. But once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore. The records exist. That part is confirmed. Officials acknowledge them. Researchers cite them. Court documents reference them by name, by date, by filing number. Catalog entries list them as received and stored, on paper, and sometimes literally on paper. These records are part of the official historical account. They are treated as real, as valid, and as accessible. And yet, when someone actually tries to locate the original, when a researcher submits a formal request, when a lawyer asks for the physical file, when a journalist follows the paper trail to its supposed end, the record is not there, not destroyed, not classified under a restriction that prevents access, simply not where it is supposed to be. That distinction matters. A destroyed record, while concerning, at least has an explanation. A classified document is withheld for stated reasons, with a process in place for eventual review. A record that officially exists, that has been referenced and acknowledged, and yet cannot be physically located, that occupies a different category entirely. There is no formal process for a document that has simply vanished from a place it was supposed to remain. This happens more often than most people realize. That is not a claim without basis. It is something that emerges when you look at the experiences of archival researchers, investigative journalists, and legal professionals who regularly work with primary source documents. Across different institutions, different countries, and different subject areas, the same experience surfaces repeatedly. The catalog says the record is there. The institution confirms it should be there. But when the request is made and the search is conducted, the result is the same: unavailable. Not for a stated reason, simply unavailable. A government archive lists a document as part of its collection. A National Library catalog shows a record was received on a specific date. A court filing from decades ago references a supporting document by its exact title. These are not vague references. These are formal, specific acknowledgments that a record was created, was received, and was stored. The institutional trail leading to the record is intact, but the record at the end of that trail is not. This raises a question that sounds simple on the surface. Where did they go? It is the kind of question a child might ask. Straightforward, direct, and yet it turns out to be surprisingly difficult to answer. The institutions responsible for these records, the archives, the libraries, the government departments, do not always have a clear response. Sometimes the response is a referral to another department. Sometimes it is a form letter explaining that the search is ongoing. Sometimes there's no response at all. It doesn't fully make sense. And that is the part worth sitting with for a moment. These are not personal files kept in someone's home. These are records held within secured institutional systems, managed by trained staff, protected by documented procedures. When a record enters an archive, there is a process. When it is accessed, there is a log. When it is moved, there is a transfer record. The entire system is built around the idea that items within it can be tracked and located at any time. Records don't simply disappear from these systems without leaving some kind of trace, or at least, they are not supposed to. And yet in the cases being examined, even the trace is sometimes missing. There is no log of removal. There is no transfer record pointing to a new location. There is no damage report explaining a physical loss. The record simply reaches a point in the institutional timeline and then stops appearing. At first, it is tempting to explain this away as administrative error. Large institutions manage enormous volumes of material. A misfiled document, an incomplete log, a record that was moved without proper paperwork. These are all real possibilities, and they do happen. No system is perfectly maintained. No institution is immune to human error. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the cases that raise the most questions are not random in their distribution. When researchers look at which records tend to go missing, a pattern appears that is difficult to attribute to random administrative failure. Certain types of records are absent more often than others. Certain time periods show higher rates of unavailability. And in several documented cases, the records that cannot be located are precisely the ones that would carry the most weight in a legal or historical review of a given event or institution. If the loss were truly random, if it were simply the result of inadequate storage or clerical error spread evenly across all types of documents, you would expect to see a roughly equal distribution of absence. Old records, unimportant records, records about minor administrative matters, all equally at risk. But that is not what appears. The pattern, such as it is, tends to concentrate around records that are specific, significant, and directly relevant to questions that someone, somewhere, might reasonably want answered. Some researchers point to this concentration and say it deserves a formal explanation, not an accusation, not a conclusion, simply an explanation that goes beyond what has been offered so far. The current explanations, transfer, digitization, natural deterioration, are general in nature. They describe categories of events that can cause record loss. What they do not do is address why the loss follows a pattern, or why that pattern keeps appearing across institutions that have no obvious connection to one another. Others disagree with this framing entirely. They argue that the pattern is a product of selection bias, that researchers who are looking for records related to specific subjects are simply more likely to notice and document when those records are missing. The records that are present, by definition, don't generate the same attention. This is a reasonable counterpoint, and it is worth holding alongside the other observations. The picture is not complete enough to dismiss either view. And yet, in case after case, across different countries and different time periods, the same sequence plays out. A record is created. A record is formally acknowledged within an institutional system. That record is referenced in later documents, confirming it was known and considered to exist. And then, at some point, the record becomes unreachable. Not dramatically, not suddenly, quietly. It simply stops being findable. What makes this pattern more than just a record-keeping curiosity is the question of what these records represent. Official documents, government filings, court records, archival materials, are not simply administrative objects. They are the foundation of how history is understood, how legal decisions are made, and how institutions are held accountable for their actions over time. When a record that was once part of that foundation becomes unreachable, something changes, not loudly, but in ways that are real and that accumulate. No one seems to have a clear answer for why this is happening or how widespread it actually is. That is not a rhetorical statement. It reflects a genuine gap in formal study. There is no comprehensive international database of missing official records. There is no standardized system for reporting or investigating document unavailability. Researchers who encounter missing records typically pursue the question through whatever formal request channels are available to them, encounter a wall, and then, in most cases, move on to sources that can actually be accessed. And what makes this more unusual is that very few people are asking the question out loud, not because it lacks importance, but because the question sits in an uncomfortable space. It is too specific to attract broad public attention, and too diffuse to be easily addressed by any single institution or authority. The researchers who notice it tend to notice it as part of a larger project, focused on something else. The record was supposed to support an argument or verify a fact, and its absence is an obstacle to that goal, not the main story. But perhaps it should be the main story, or at least, it deserves to be examined as one. This is where the investigation begins, not with a conclusion about what happened, or why, not with a theory about intent or purpose, simply with the observation that something is not adding up. Records that should be findable are not findable. Explanations that should be straightforward are not straightforward. And a pattern that should, if it were truly random, look very different from what it actually looks like. The question of where these records went is still open. It has not been answered formally. It has not been studied at the scale that would be needed to draw any firm conclusions. And in that absence of a clear answer, the question continues to sit, quietly, patiently, at the edge of the official account. Where the official record ends, and where the actual explanation should begin, there is a gap. Understanding what is in that gap, and why it exists, is what this investigation is about. When researchers or journalists raise concerns about missing records, institutions rarely respond with silence. There is almost always an answer. The answer comes relatively quickly. It is delivered with confidence, and it sounds entirely reasonable. That is worth noting, not because the explanations are necessarily wrong, but because the confidence with which they are offered sometimes discourages the follow-up questions that should naturally come next. The response, in most cases, follows a familiar pattern. It doesn't vary much between institutions, or even between countries. Whether the concern is raised to a national archive, a government ministry, a municipal record office, or a court administration, the explanation tends to move in one of three directions. And understanding each of those directions carefully is important, because each one holds up under casual inspection, but begins to raise questions when examined more closely. The first explanation is administrative transfer. This is perhaps the most commonly offered response. Records, institutions explain, were not lost, they were moved. A department was reorganized. A building was closed or repurposed. A decision was made at some point to consolidate materials into a centralized national archive. The original location no longer holds the records, but that does not mean the records are gone. They are simply somewhere else. Accessible in theory, if you know which office to contact and which request form to use. This explanation is presented as straightforward, and in many cases, administrative transfers do happen exactly as described. Institutions genuinely do consolidate records. Buildings are closed. Departments merge. Files move. None of that is unusual. But this is where it becomes unclear, because when a transfer happens within a properly functioning archival system, it leaves a trail. There is a transfer form. There is a receiving signature from the institution or department that accepted the materials. There is an updated catalog entry reflecting the new location. The whole point of the documentation surrounding a transfer is to ensure that the record can still be found after it moves. So the reasonable follow-up question is, where are those transfer logs? If a record was moved, show the document that confirms it was moved, when it was moved, and where it went. In a functioning system, that document should exist and should be retrievable almost immediately. But in a number of documented cases, researchers who asked exactly that question, show me the transfer record, received no satisfactory answer. The transfer log was unavailable, or it was said to be in another department, or the request was acknowledged and then never followed up on. This does not prove the transfer didn't happen, but it does raise a question that the explanation itself doesn't resolve. The second explanation is digitization. This one carries a particular weight because it is tied to a real and well-documented historical process, starting in the 1980s, and accelerating significantly through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, governments and institutions around the world began converting their paper records into digital formats. The motivation was practical. Digital storage takes less physical space. Digital records are easier to search and share. And digital formats, it was believed, would be more durable over time than paper stored in aging facilities. During this process, physical documents were handled in different ways, depending on the institution and the country. Some were scanned and then carefully archived in both formats, digital and physical. Others were scanned and then boxed, with the boxes placed in long-term storage that was less accessible than the original filing system. And in some cases, physical documents were disposed of after scanning, on the basis that the digital version now served as the official record. Each of these approaches was considered legitimate at the time, at least within certain institutional frameworks. At first, this seems like a complete explanation. The paper is gone, but the digital version exists. Problem solved. But there is a problem. When researchers request the digital versions of records that supposedly went through this process, when they ask for the scanned file that replaced the physical document, those digital versions are sometimes also unavailable. The institution confirms that digitization happened. It confirms that the physical document no longer exists in its original form, but it cannot produce the digital file that was supposed to replace it. This creates a gap that the digitization explanation does not bridge. If the physical record was disposed of after scanning, and the digital record cannot be located, then the record is effectively gone, regardless of which label is placed on the reason. And what makes this particularly difficult to investigate is that the disposal of the physical record was often treated as a routine administrative decision, recorded only minimally, if at all. There may be a general policy document authorizing disposal of certain categories of records after digitization, but a specific log showing which individual documents were destroyed, and confirming that a verified digital copy existed at the time. That level of documentation is often absent. The third explanation is natural deterioration. This is the most quietly accepted of the three, perhaps because it requires no process to have failed and no decision to be questioned. Old records deteriorate. This is simply true. Paper breaks down over time, especially when stored in conditions that are not temperature-controlled or humidity-regulated. Ink fades. Bindings fail. In older storage facilities, basements, attics, repurposed rooms that were never designed for archival purposes, the conditions were often far from ideal. Some loss, institutions argue, is simply the natural result of time passing and storage conditions being imperfect. And again, this is not wrong as a general statement. Physical deterioration is a real cause of record loss, and it has affected archives in every country in the world. No one disputes that. But this is where the explanation becomes difficult to fully accept in specific cases. Because when a record deteriorates, when paper crumbles, when ink becomes unreadable, when a file becomes too fragile to handle, that event is supposed to be documented. There should be a damage report, a conservation note, some record of the record's condition at the time it became unreadable or unusable. More importantly, if a document deteriorates beyond recovery, the catalog entry for that document should be updated to reflect that. It should be marked as lost, as damaged, as no longer available. But in many of the cases being examined, the catalog entries remain as they were originally created. They still list the record as part of the collection. They still show a location. They give no indication that the document they described no longer exists in a usable form. So a researcher approaching the catalog has no way of knowing, in advance, that what they are looking for is already gone. These three explanations, transfer, digitization, deterioration, are reasonable in isolation. Each one describes a real process that genuinely happens in archival management, and when offered in response to a specific question about a specific missing record, they sound authoritative. They invoke established procedures and known historical events. They position the absence of the record within a larger, understandable context. But when you step back and look at all three together, a question emerges. Each explanation points to a process that should itself leave evidence. A transfer leaves a log. Digitization leaves a digital file. Deterioration leaves a damage report and an updated catalog entry. If any of these processes occurred properly, the evidence of that process should be available, even if the original record is not. The explanation, in other words, should be verifiable. And this is where the official position begins to show its limits. Because in many of the cases where these explanations are offered, the supporting evidence for the explanation is also missing. The transfer log cannot be produced. The digital file does not appear in the system. The damage report was never filed, or cannot be located. The catalog entry was never updated. The explanation is offered, but the evidence that would confirm the explanation is absent. Some believe this is simply the result of compounding failures. Systems break down. Processes are followed inconsistently. Staff change, priorities shift, and documentation that should have been created was never completed. This is a generous but not unreasonable interpretation. Large institutions are not perfect, and expecting perfect documentation of every administrative action over decades is perhaps unrealistic. Others disagree. They point out that the explanations are offered with a confidence that seems inconsistent with the level of documentation actually available to support them. If an institution cannot produce the transfer log, the digital file, or the damage report, how does it know which explanation applies? How can it state with assurance that a record was transferred, rather than digitized or deteriorated, if the evidence for the transfer cannot be found? That question has not been answered clearly, and it points to something worth holding on to as this investigation continues. The explanations cover the surface of the problem. They account for why a record might not be in its original location, but they do not fully account for why the evidence of what happened to the record is also, in many cases, absent. That is a second layer of missing information, and it is one that the official explanations, as they are currently offered, do not address. The explanation exists. It sounds reasonable, but underneath the explanation, the questions remain open. The official explanations, when heard for the first time, sound adequate. Transfer, digitization, natural deterioration. Each one describes a real process, uses familiar institutional language, and places the missing record within a recognizable context. For many people who encounter these explanations, that is enough. The question is answered, at least on the surface, and the conversation moves forward. But there is a point at which the surface explanation and the actual evidence stop matching. It doesn't happen immediately. It happens when someone decides to go one step further, not to accept the explanation, but to verify it. And it is at that point, when verification is attempted, that the administrative explanations begin to weaken in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Take the transfer argument specifically, because it is the most commonly offered and the most testable of the three explanations. The claim is straightforward. The record was moved. It is no longer at its original location because it was transferred to another department, another building, another institution. This is presented as a routine administrative event, something that happens regularly within large record-keeping systems. And it does happen regularly. That part is not in dispute. Records are transferred between institutions all the time, for legitimate reasons, as part of normal archival management. But what makes a transfer legitimate, what makes it traceable and verifiable, is the documentation that surrounds it. When a record moves from one institution to another within a properly functioning archival system, that movement is supposed to be captured in writing at every stage. There is a transfer form, initiated by the sending institution. There is a receiving document, signed by the institution that accepts the materials. There is an updated catalog entry at the original location, noting that the record has been transferred and indicating where it has gone. And there's a new catalog entry at the receiving institution, confirming the record's arrival. These are not optional steps. They are not bureaucratic formalities that can be skipped when time is short or staff is limited. They are the foundation of how an archival system maintains accountability over its holdings. Without them, the system cannot function as designed. This is why what happened in several documented cases is worth examining carefully. Researchers who were told the record had been transferred did something reasonable. They asked for the transfer documentation, not the record itself. They already knew it wasn't at the original location. They asked for the paperwork that would confirm the transfer had taken place. The form, the receiving signature, the updated catalog entry, the basic evidence that the explanation offered was actually true. And this is where it becomes unclear, because in a number of these cases, the response to that request was not a document. It was a delay, sometimes a referral to a different department, which then referred back to the original department, creating a loop that produced no actual documentation. In some cases, after weeks or months of follow-up, the institution confirmed that the transfer log itself could not be located. Not the record, the log. The piece of paper that was supposed to prove the record had been moved was also missing. This raises a quiet but genuinely important question. If both the original record and the documentation of what happened to it are absent, what does that actually tell us? At minimum, it tells us that the explanation being offered cannot be independently verified. The institution is saying the record was transferred, but it cannot show the evidence that would confirm a transfer occurred. These are two very different things, and the difference between them matters. Some believe this points to internal disorganization, and that explanation deserves to be taken seriously before anything else is considered. Large institutions are genuinely complex environments. A national archive, for example, may manage tens of millions of individual records spanning centuries. The staff responsible for those records change over time. Procedures that were standard in one decade may have been applied inconsistently in another. A form that should have been filed was overlooked. A catalog entry that should have been updated was left as it was. Over years and decades, these small administrative gaps accumulate. This is a real phenomenon. Archival professionals acknowledge it. It is the reason why professional standards for record management exist and are periodically updated, because the history of institutional record-keeping is partly a history of managing and correcting these kinds of failures. So when a transfer log cannot be produced, internal disorganization is a legitimate first explanation to consider. It requires no unusual circumstances. It fits within what is known about how large institutions actually function. But this is where the disorganization argument starts to encounter its own difficulty, because disorganization, by its nature, is random. It affects records unevenly. without pattern, based on which staff members were attentive, which filing systems were well maintained, which periods had adequate resources, and which did not. If missing transfer logs were simply the result of accumulated administrative error, you would expect to find them distributed in roughly the same way across all types of records: old records and newer ones, significant records and minor ones, records on sensitive subjects and records on entirely routine matters. Others disagree that this is what the evidence shows, and their disagreement is worth examining carefully because it is not based on assumption. It is based on pattern. When researchers began comparing their experiences across different institutions and different countries, they noticed something that the disorganization explanation struggles to account for. The records that tend to be missing, and whose transfer documentation also tends to be missing, are often not random in their subject matter. They are specific. They relate to particular events, events that were significant, that were contested, or that had legal or political implications. They relate to particular individuals, people who held positions of authority, or who were the subject of investigations, or whose actions at a certain point in time became a matter of public or legal interest. And they relate to particular time periods, windows of time, during which something notable was happening within or around the institution that held the records. At first, it seems like this could still be explained by disorganization. Perhaps sensitive records were handled more frequently, accessed by more people, and therefore more likely to be misfiled or mishandled. That argument has been made, and it is not entirely without logic. Records that are referenced and accessed regularly do face greater risk of displacement than records that sit untouched for decades. But there is a problem with that reasoning when applied to the specific cases under examination, because in many of these cases, the records were not heavily accessed. They were not popular research subjects that dozens of people had handled over the years. They were specific, often obscure documents that were sought out by individual researchers for particular purposes. The argument that frequent handling led to misplacement does not hold up when the record in question was rarely, if ever, accessed before the researcher who found it missing tried to locate it. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult to fully accept, because if the records are not missing randomly, and if they are not missing because of frequent handling, and if the documentation that should explain their absence is also missing, then the disorganization argument is being asked to explain more than it can reasonably account for. It is being stretched from a plausible explanation for occasional gaps into a complete theory for a pattern that looks, on examination, like something more deliberate or at least more consistent. That does not mean the alternative is clear. It is not. Saying that the disorganization explanation has limits is not the same as saying what the correct explanation is. These are two separate things, and it is important not to collapse them into one. The fact that one explanation is insufficient does not automatically validate another. What it does is open a space, a gap, where further questions are needed and where further investigation is warranted. The researchers who have documented these cases tend to be careful about how they describe what they found. They note the pattern. They note the absence of documentation. They note the inadequacy of the official explanation when applied to specific cases. And they stop there, not because the investigation is complete, but because the evidence available does not yet support a firmer conclusion. That restraint is appropriate, but it should not be mistaken for resolution. The pattern has been observed. The explanation that has been offered does not fully account for it, and the gap between what institutions say happened and what can actually be verified remains open. What makes this first doubt significant is not that it proves anything. It is that it survives scrutiny. When you look at the transfer argument closely, when you ask for the supporting documentation and find that it is also missing, the explanation does not hold at the level of detail it needs to hold. Something is not fully accounted for, and that something is specific enough and consistent enough across enough cases to be worth continuing to examine. The administrative explanations are still on the table. They have not been disproven, but they have been questioned in a way that they have not yet answered. And that unresolved question is where the next stage of this investigation begins. To understand why missing records matter as much as they do, it helps to take a step back, not to look at specific cases or individual institutions, but to look at something more fundamental: how record-keeping systems were designed, why they were built the way they were, and what they were actually meant to accomplish. Because without that context, the disappearance of a document can seem like a minor administrative inconvenience. With it, the same disappearance looks like something considerably more significant. Most modern archival systems were not built for convenience. That is an important starting point. The purpose of an archive is not simply to store information in an organized way, the way a library stores books for readers to borrow. The deeper purpose is accountability. Records exist so that institutions, governments, courts, financial bodies, administrative agencies can be reviewed. They can be audited. They can be questioned. And they can be held responsible for decisions they made, sometimes decades after those decisions were taken. Without the records, that accountability becomes extremely difficult to exercise. In some cases, it becomes impossible. This is why governments around the world maintain such a wide range of official documents. Court records preserve the details of legal proceedings long after the people involved have moved on or passed away. Census documents establish population data that affects resource allocation, political representation, and historical understanding. Land registries confirm who owns what, and trace the chain of ownership back through time in ways that matter enormously to individuals and communities. Financial filings create a documented record of how money moved through institutions, who authorized those movements, and under what circumstances. Each of these categories of records serves a function that goes far beyond simple data storage. They are the evidence base upon which legal decisions, historical conclusions, and institutional reviews depend. Losing them, therefore, is not a minor matter. It creates what some archival scholars describe as a gap in the chain, a break in the documented sequence of events that makes it harder, or sometimes impossible, to reconstruct what actually happened. And this is why, historically, the loss of significant records was treated with a seriousness that might seem disproportionate to modern eyes. In many societies and legal systems, the deliberate destruction of official records was not just a policy failure. It was a crime. The understanding behind that position was clear. If the records are gone, accountability goes with them. For centuries, physical archives were the primary, and often the only, method of preserving this accountability. Documents were stored in designated buildings, purpose-built or carefully adapted for the task. Access was restricted and logged. Trained staff managed the collections, following established procedures for cataloging, retrieving, and returning materials. The system was imperfect, as any human system is, but it operated on a clear principle. Every significant record had a place, and that place was known and maintained. When a record was lost or damaged, it was treated as a failure of the system, something to be investigated, documented, and prevented from happening again. This approach worked, within its limitations, for a very long time. The physical constraints of paper-based archives, the need for space, the vulnerability of materials to fire and water and time, were understood and managed as best they could be. Institutions developed protocols for protecting records considered particularly important. Copies were sometimes made of critical documents. Storage conditions were improved as resources allowed. The goal was preservation, and while it was never perfectly achieved, the framework for pursuing it was clear and consistently applied. Then digital systems arrived, and with them came an expectation, reasonable, widely shared, and strongly promoted, that reliability would improve dramatically. The arguments in favor of digital record-keeping were compelling. A digital file takes no physical space. It can be copied instantly and stored in multiple locations simultaneously. It can be backed up remotely, protected against local disasters like fire or flooding. It can be searched, retrieved, and shared far more efficiently than any paper document. In theory, a record stored digitally should be essentially permanent. Multiple backup copies, held in geographically separate locations, with redundant systems, ensuring that if one copy is lost, others remain intact. The transition from paper to digital was treated, in many institutional contexts, as an upgrade, a move toward greater security and reliability. And in many ways, for many types of records, it has been exactly that. Digital systems have preserved vast quantities of information that might otherwise have deteriorated or been lost. This is not in question, but this is where it becomes unclear. because some of the most puzzling and difficult to explain cases of missing records involve documents from exactly the period when this transition was taking place, roughly the 1980s through the early 2000s. This was the window during which paper systems were being wound down and digital systems were being built up. It was a period of significant institutional change, of shifting procedures and evolving standards, of decisions being made about which records to convert, how to convert them, and what to do with the originals afterward. And it is from this specific window that a notable number of records have effectively disappeared. Not records from the distant past, stored on fragile materials in inadequate conditions over many decades. Records from a relatively recent period, acknowledged as received, referenced in subsequent documents, confirmed by institutions as records that should exist within their holdings. Records that, by every indication, entered the system and were registered as part of it, but that cannot now be produced when requested. At first, this seems like it might simply reflect the challenges of the transition period itself. Moving from one system to another is always complicated. Procedures are not always consistently followed. Staff managing the transition may have applied different standards in different cases. Some records may have fallen through procedural gaps that only became visible years later, when someone tried to retrieve them. This explanation is not unreasonable, and it fits with what is generally known about large-scale institutional transitions. But there is a problem with applying it too broadly. The digital systems that were introduced during this period were specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of loss. The whole point of redundant backups, remote storage, and systematic cataloging was to ensure that records could not simply vanish. If a record was entered into a digital system with proper cataloging, retrieving it, even years later, should be a straightforward process. The system was built for exactly that purpose. So when a record from this period cannot be produced, the question is not just where the record went. The question is how it became unavailable within a system that was specifically designed to make unavailability nearly impossible. Some believe the answer lies in the inconsistency of implementation. Not all institutions adopted digital systems at the same pace or with the same rigor. Some departments transitioned fully and carefully. Others maintained hybrid systems for years, with some records fully digitized and others remaining in paper form with varying levels of catalog integration. In these hybrid environments, gaps were more likely to develop. Records that were partially entered into digital systems, or that were cataloged under one system, and then not carried over when that system was replaced by a newer one. Others point to something slightly different. They note that the records which are hardest to locate from this transition period are not evenly distributed across subject categories. Records on routine administrative matters from the same period are often available and retrievable without difficulty. It is specific categories, particular subjects, particular institutions, particular individuals, where the gaps appear most consistently, and that distribution, they argue, is harder to explain through implementation inconsistency alone. This raises questions that have not been formally addressed. If the gaps were purely the result of transition challenges, why do they cluster the way they appear to cluster? Why are some categories of records from this period readily accessible while others, from the same institutions and the same time frame, remain out of reach? The timing of the disappearances, falling within the very period when record-keeping was supposed to become more reliable, not less, adds a layer of difficulty to the standard explanations. There is something slightly unusual about that timing. A period defined by investment in preservation and reliability is also, it turns out, a period from which some notable absences originate. That is not a conclusion. It is an observation, one that the available explanations have not yet fully addressed, and one that sits quietly at the center of what makes this investigation worth continuing. The background matters because it sets the standard. Archival systems were built to prevent exactly the kind of loss being observed. When that loss occurs anyway, and when it occurs in patterns that the system's own design should have prevented, the gap between the standard and the reality is where the most important questions begin. There's a point in this investigation where the missing records stop being an abstract problem and become something more concrete and more difficult to set aside. That point arrives when you look at a specific category of cases, not records that disappeared quietly, without anyone noticing, in the back rooms of underfunded archives, but records that were actively used. Records that were cited in public, referenced in formal proceedings, quoted in official documents. Records that, by every measure, were known to exist at a specific point in time, and that then, when independent parties tried to locate the originals, could not be produced. This is a meaningfully different situation from anything examined so far. In the earlier stages of this investigation, the focus was on records that went missing during transfers, or during the digitization process, or through deterioration in inadequate storage conditions. Those cases are troubling in their own right, but there is at least a plausible sequence of events that could explain them. A record enters a system, something goes wrong in handling or storage, and the record is no longer findable. Unfortunate, but theoretically possible within the known limitations of institutional record-keeping. The cases in this chapter do not fit that sequence. These are records that did not disappear quietly before anyone noticed they were gone. They disappeared, or became unreachable, after they had already been used, after they had already been seen, after their existence had already been formally confirmed, in writing, in official contexts. That is a distinction that matters, and it is one that the standard explanations struggle to account for. Consider what it means for a record to be cited in an official proceeding. A court filing references a document by its title, its date, and its content. A government report quotes from a record and attributes the quote to a specific archived source. An official statement draws on information contained in a file that is named and identified. In each of these situations, the institution doing the citing is making an implicit confirmation. This record exists. We have seen it. And we're using it as the basis for something we are saying publicly. The record's existence is not just assumed. It is formally vouched for. And then, when an independent researcher or a journalist or a legal professional submits a request to access that same record, the original, the one that was cited, they are told it is unavailable. Not that it never existed. Not that the citation was an error, simply that the original cannot currently be accessed. At first, the explanations offered sound familiar. The record is under review. There are legal restrictions on access at this time. The file has been transferred to another location, and the new location is being confirmed. These are phrases that have appeared before in this investigation, language that positions the unavailability as temporary, as procedural, as something that will be resolved through the proper channels in due course. But this is where it becomes unclear, because in a significant number of these cases, the follow-up that was implied never materialized. The review process did not conclude with the record becoming available. The legal restriction was never lifted or even formally explained. The transfer confirmation never arrived. Researchers who submitted formal requests waited the required response period and then followed up, sometimes repeatedly, over months or years, received no final answer. The temporary unavailability simply remained, indefinitely. And what makes this particularly difficult to accept as a routine administrative outcome is the behavior of the institutions involved during this period of non-response. They did not acknowledge the outstanding request as an ongoing matter requiring resolution. They did not issue updates explaining why the process was taking longer than expected. They moved forward with their regular activities as if the question about the record had been answered, even though it had not been answered, even though the person who asked the question was still waiting for a response that never came. This pattern of institutional continuation, of moving forward as if a problem is resolved when it has not been resolved, is one of the more unusual aspects of these cases. In a normal administrative process, an outstanding formal request represents an open obligation. The institution that received the request is responsible for responding to it. If the response is delayed, there are procedures for explaining the delay. If access is being denied, there are procedures for formally stating that denial and providing the grounds for it. What is not part of any standard procedure is simply not responding, while behaving as though the matter has been closed. Some believe this is a reflection of institutional capacity problems. Large organizations, particularly government ones, manage enormous volumes of correspondence and formal requests. Some requests fall through the cracks. Follow-ups are missed. Staff changes mean that ongoing obligations are not carried forward from one person to the next. Over time, an unanswered request simply ages out of anyone's active awareness, without ever being formally resolved. This explanation is offered with some regularity, and it does describe something real about how institutions sometimes fail. But there is a problem with applying it uniformly to these cases, because the requests that went unanswered were not minor, informal inquiries. They were formal submissions, made through official channels, often with legal standing, the kind of requests that institutions are required to track and respond to under their own procedural rules and, in many jurisdictions, under freedom of information legislation. These are not the kinds of requests that fall through administrative cracks accidentally. They are the kinds of requests that generate a paper trail of their own, a record of the request, a record of receipt, a record of the response timeline. And yet, in these cases, even that secondary accountability mechanism does not appear to have produced the required outcome. Others disagree with the capacity explanation on a more fundamental level. They point out that the records involved in these cases share a characteristic that distinguishes them from routine archival gaps. These are records that were actively used, meaning someone, within the institution, had access to them at the point when they were cited. The record was not sitting untouched in a storage room. It was in someone's hands. It was being read, quoted, or referenced as the basis for an official statement or document. And then, when an outside party asked to see the same record, access became impossible. This raises a question that is difficult to answer without further information. Between the moment a record was used internally and the moment an outside party requested access to it, something changed. What changed? The record did not suddenly deteriorate. It had just been used. It did not get lost in a transfer. Someone within the institution clearly knew where it was. Whatever explanation accounts for the unavailability must account for this gap, for the fact that the record was accessible at one point and then was not. And none of the standard explanations do that adequately. And this is where the explanation starts to weaken in a more significant way than anything seen in the earlier stages of this investigation. The earlier cases allowed for the possibility that records were lost before anyone was watching closely. These cases do not allow for that possibility. These records were watched. They were used. Their existence was formally confirmed. The trail does not go cold in a storage room decades ago. It goes cold in a much more recent, much more documented, much more observable moment. What that means is not yet fully clear. There are multiple possible interpretations, and none of them can be confirmed with the information currently available. It is possible that institutional processes broke down in ways that are unusual but not deliberate. It is possible that legal or procedural restrictions are genuinely in place and simply have not been communicated transparently. It is possible that the explanation exists somewhere within the institution and simply has not been shared with the people asking. All of these possibilities remain open. None of them can be ruled out, but none of them have been confirmed either. And in the absence of a confirmed explanation, what remains is the observable fact. Records that were demonstrably in use became unreachable. Requests for those records went formally unanswered, and the institutions that held them moved forward without resolving the question. It is one thing to lose a document that no one was watching. Records disappear from unmonitored storage, and while that is a problem, it is at least a problem with the recognizable shape. But it is something different, something that sits outside the boundaries of routine archival failure. When a document that was actively in use, formally cited, and publicly referenced becomes unreachable, and when the question of where it went is met not with an answer, but with silence. That silence is not an explanation. It is the place where an explanation should be. And the fact that the space remains empty, after formal requests, after follow-up, after the passage of time, is what makes this layer of the investigation harder to set aside than anything that came before it. By this point in the investigation, a reasonable person might be willing to accept that some of what has been described reflects isolated failures, specific institutions with specific problems, individual cases where administrative processes broke down in ways that were unusual, but not necessarily connected to anything larger. That is a fair position to hold, and it deserves to be taken seriously before it is set aside. But the cases do not remain isolated. The more carefully the available evidence is examined, and the more broadly the search is extended across different institutions and different countries, the harder it becomes to treat each case as separate and unconnected, because the same sequence keeps appearing, not in a vague or general way, in a specific, recognizable, repeating pattern that surfaces across contexts that have very little else in common. The sequence is consistent. A record is created within an institutional system. Its creation is acknowledged, cataloged, registered, formally entered into the record of what the institution holds. The record is then referenced, cited in subsequent documents, used as the basis for decisions or statements, acknowledged as part of the evidential foundation for something that happened. And then, at some point after that acknowledgement, the record becomes unavailable. It cannot be retrieved. It cannot be produced. And the explanation for why it cannot be produced is either absent, or insufficient, or itself unverifiable. That sequence, on its own, might be explainable as coincidence or as the shared consequences of similar institutional pressures. But the contexts in which it appears make coincidence a difficult argument to sustain. Different countries, operating under different legal systems, with different administrative traditions, different languages, different levels of institutional funding, and different historical relationships to record-keeping. And yet the same sequence appears. Different record types, court documents, financial filings, government correspondence, land records, personnel files, and yet the same sequence appears. Different time periods, ranging from the mid-20th century through to the early 2000s, and yet the same sequence appears. This is where the investigation moves into territory that requires careful handling. The repetition of a pattern is not, by itself, proof of anything beyond the pattern's existence. It does not confirm a cause. It does not identify a responsible party. It does not explain the mechanism by which the pattern is produced. What it does do is make certain explanations significantly harder to accept, specifically, explanations that depend on randomness, coincidence, or isolated institutional failure. Those explanations lose credibility precisely in proportion to how consistently and widely the pattern repeats. Some researchers who have studied this area have introduced a term that is worth understanding carefully. They refer to what they observe as selective absence. It is important to be precise about what this term means and what it does not mean. It is not a claim that records were deliberately removed or destroyed by any identifiable party for any identifiable purpose. The researchers who use this term are explicit about that. They are not making a claim about intent. They are making a claim about distribution. Specifically, that the absences they observe are not distributed in the way that random or accidental loss would predict. Random loss has a recognizable shape. When records are lost through genuinely random processes, inadequate storage, accidental damage, administrative errors distributed evenly across a system, the resulting gaps appear without strong clustering around any particular subject category, any particular time period, or any particular type of institution. The gaps are spread across the full range of what an archive holds, because the forces producing those gaps do not discriminate between one type of record and another. But this is where it becomes unclear, because selective absence, as observed and documented by researchers tracking this pattern, does not have that shape. The gaps are not evenly distributed. They cluster. They cluster around particular subjects, events that were contested, decisions that were consequential, individuals whose actions became matters of public or legal interest. They cluster around particular institutions, not uniformly across all archives of a similar type, but in specific cases where the records would carry particular weight if they were available and reviewable. And they cluster around particular windows of time, often periods during which significant decisions were being made or significant events were unfolding. At first, it seems possible to explain this clustering through a different kind of innocent mechanism. Perhaps records related to significant events were handled more frequently, accessed by more people, moved more often, subjected to more administrative processes, and therefore more likely to be misplaced or damaged through overuse. This argument has been made, and it is not entirely without logic. High-use records do face different risks than records that sit untouched for decades. But there is a problem with this explanation when it is applied to the cases being examined, because the clustering does not follow a high-use pattern. Many of the records that are now missing were not widely accessed before their absence was noticed. They were not popular research subjects. They were not documents that dozens of researchers had requested over the years, creating multiple opportunities for mishandling. In many cases, the researcher who discovered the record was missing was among the first, or the first in a very long time, to request access to it. The high-use explanation requires the record to have been frequently handled. The evidence, in many cases, suggests the opposite. This raises questions that have not been formally studied at the scale they appear to deserve. Why does this pattern exist? That is the foundational question, and it has not been answered. There is no comprehensive formal investigation into the distribution of record unavailability across institutional archives. There is no international body that tracks and analyzes which types of records go missing, from which types of institutions, and under what circumstances. The pattern has been observed by individual researchers, noted in academic papers, and raised in occasional journalism, but it has not been the subject of the kind of systematic, well-resourced inquiry that its consistency and breadth would seem to warrant. Who is responsible for investigating it? That question is also unresolved. In most institutional frameworks, the body responsible for maintaining records is also the body responsible for explaining when records cannot be found. This creates an obvious tension. An institution investigating its own record-keeping failures is not, by any structural standard, an independent investigation. Yet in most of the cases where missing records have been raised as a concern, the response has come from within the institution that holds, or is supposed to hold, the record in question. An external, independent review of the pattern is largely absent from the existing record. And then there is a third question that may be the most important of all. Why, in most cases, does the question stop being asked after the initial request is denied? This is something that researchers who have tracked individual cases observe consistently. A formal request is submitted. The response is a denial, or a delay, or a referral that leads nowhere. The researcher follows up once, perhaps twice, and then, in most cases, the inquiry effectively ends. Not because the question was answered, but because the mechanisms available for pursuing it further are limited, slow, and uncertain, and the researcher has other work to do. This is not a criticism of the researchers involved. It reflects the structural reality of how formal access requests work in most jurisdictions. The process is designed to provide access to records that exist and are retrievable. It is not designed to compel an institution to explain, at a level of forensic detail, how a record that should exist became unavailable. There's a gap in the accountability framework, a space where the question of what happened to a record should be answerable, but is not required to be answered in any formal, binding way. Others have pointed to this structural gap as part of the reason the pattern persists. If institutions were required to formally account for every record that becomes unavailable, to document what happened to it, to have that documentation reviewed by an independent body, and to face consequences if the documentation is absent or insufficient, the pattern might look different, or the explanations for it might become clearer. But that requirement does not exist in most systems, and in its absence, the pattern continues without formal examination. What remains, then, is the repetition itself, unresolved and unexplained at the level of detail it requires. The same sequence across different countries, different record types, different institutions, and different time periods. A pattern that does not match the shape of random loss. A clustering that the available explanations do not adequately account for. And a set of questions. Why does this pattern exist? Who should investigate it? And why does the inquiry so often stop? That remain formally open. The repetition is not a conclusion. It is an observation. But it is an observation that is difficult to set aside once it has been clearly seen. And it points towards something in this investigation that has not yet been fully examined, something about the structure of the problem itself, and about why it has remained, for this long, without a satisfying answer. There is a point in any investigation where the subject stops being contained, where what began as a specific, bounded question starts connecting to something broader, something that touches not just individual cases, but the systems those cases exist within. This investigation has reached that point. What started as a question about missing documents is now a question about what happens when documents go missing, who is affected, and why the problem persists without resolution. The connection to something larger becomes visible when you look at consequences, not the abstract consequences of poor record-keeping in general terms, but the specific, concrete effects that follow when a particular record cannot be produced at a particular moment. Because a missing record is not simply an administrative gap. It is an absence that lands somewhere. It affects something. And in many cases, it affects people, real individuals and communities whose ability to establish facts, assert rights, or seek accountability depends directly on the existence of a record that is no longer available. When a record cannot be produced, the most immediate consequence is a gap in the evidentiary chain. Legal claims that depend on documentary evidence become significantly harder to advance. A person attempting to establish an inheritance right, to prove that a piece of land or a financial asset was legally transferred to a family member, may find that the key document confirming that transfer cannot be located within the archive that is supposed to hold it. The claim does not disappear, but without the record, it becomes far more difficult to substantiate in any formal legal process. And in many jurisdictions, a claim without documentary evidence is a claim that is unlikely to succeed, regardless of its actual validity. This is not a hypothetical problem. It surfaces in communities where historical agreements between governments and indigenous groups, between municipalities and private landowners, between states and the institutions they once governed, are now being reviewed or contested. The agreement was made. It was documented. Both parties acknowledged the documentation at the time. But when one party seeks to enforce or reference the terms of that agreement decades later, the record cannot be found. The other party may have no obligation to reconstruct what the record said, and the community or individual seeking recognition is left without the primary source they need to make their case. Historical accounts face a similar consequence, though in a different register. When primary source documents become unavailable, historians and researchers are forced to work around the gap. They reconstruct events from secondary sources, from references to the missing document in other records, from accounts written by people who saw the original, from circumstantial evidence that points toward what the record probably said. This kind of reconstruction is a legitimate historical method, and skilled historians use it well. But it is inherently less certain than working from the original document. And it is always possible that the reconstruction misses something, that the original record contained information that none of the secondary sources captured. And then there are accountability reviews. When an institution's past decisions are being examined by an inquiry, by a court, by a regulatory body, or by a parliamentary committee, the documentary record is the foundation of that examination. What did the institution decide? When did it decide it? Who authorized the decision? What information was available at the time? These questions are answered, or should be answered, by the records the institution maintained. When those records are missing, the review stalls. It cannot reach conclusions it cannot support with evidence, and the institution whose decisions are being examined benefits, at least procedurally, from the absence of the documentation that would have made the review possible. This is where it becomes unclear in a way that goes beyond simple administrative failure, because the consequence of a missing record is not neutral. It falls differently on different parties. The institution that was supposed to maintain the record and failed to do so is rarely the party most harmed by its absence. The parties most harmed are typically those who needed the record as evidence, to advance a claim, to support a historical account, or to conduct an accountability review. The asymmetry of that harm is worth noting, even without drawing conclusions about its cause. But this is where the problem deepens further, because the institutions responsible for maintaining these records rarely face formal consequences when records go missing. In most countries, there is no standard legal mechanism that holds an archive accountable for the loss of a document, not unless deliberate destruction can be proven. Accidental loss, administrative failure, inadequate storage, incomplete digitization. These are treated as unfortunate outcomes rather than actionable wrongs. The institution may be criticized. It may be subject to internal review, but the formal legal and regulatory framework in most jurisdictions does not impose penalties for record loss that falls short of proven deliberate destruction. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because of what proving deliberate destruction actually requires. To establish that a record was deliberately destroyed, you need evidence. You need documentation, internal communications, authorization records, disposal logs, that shows a deliberate decision was made to remove the record. But the evidence that would prove deliberate destruction is, in most cases, held within the same institutional system that lost the original record. If that system also failed to maintain, or chose not to maintain, the records of its own internal decisions. Then the investigation reaches a dead end before it has properly begun. The result is a circular problem. The absence of the record makes it nearly impossible to investigate the absence of the record. The institution cannot be held accountable for the loss, because the evidence needed to establish accountability is itself part of what is missing. And the legal framework that might otherwise provide a mechanism for resolution was not designed with this kind of problem in mind. It was designed to handle accidental loss, the kind of loss that is regrettable but understandable, that results from known limitations and known risks. It was not designed to handle a pattern of loss that clusters in ways that accidental loss does not, and that resists the explanations that accidental loss would normally generate. Some legal scholars have examined this gap directly. They note that freedom of information legislation, which exists in various forms in many countries and is often cited as the primary mechanism for holding institutions accountable for their records, was built on a specific assumption. The assumption is that the record exists and that the question is simply one of access. The legislation provides mechanisms for requesting access, appealing denials, and in some cases compelling disclosure. What it does not provide is a mechanism for compelling an institution to explain, at a forensic level, what happened to a record that should exist but cannot be produced. The right to access a record and the right to an explanation of a record's absence are treated, in most frameworks, as separate questions, and the second question is far less well supported than the first. Others point to a related structural gap. The bodies responsible for overseeing archival institutions, national archival authorities, government record-keeping regulators, parliamentary oversight committees, typically have mandates focused on standards and procedures rather than on investigating specific instances of record loss. They can recommend better practices. They can issue guidelines. They can audit compliance with established procedures in a general sense. But launching a detailed, case-specific investigation into why a particular record became unavailable is often outside their formal mandate, or requires a level of resources and political will that is rarely assembled for what is framed as an administrative matter. This framing is itself part of the problem. When record loss is treated as an administrative matter, a question of procedure and resource management, rather than a question of accountability and consequence, the response it generates is proportionate to that framing. Administrative problems get administrative solutions, better training for staff, improved storage conditions, updated digitization protocols. These responses may be appropriate for genuinely accidental, genuinely random record loss, but they do not address a pattern that does not look random, and they do not provide any remedy for the people and institutions that were harmed by the specific absences that have already occurred. The problem has expanded, then, in at least two directions. It has expanded outward, from individual missing records to the communities and individuals affected by their absence, and it has expanded inward, from the surface question of where the records went to the deeper structural question of why the systems designed to prevent this outcome failed to do so, and why the systems designed to provide accountability when it occurs are not equipped to handle the pattern that is actually present. What connects these two directions of expansion is something that sits at the center of the whole investigation. The records that are missing were part of a system built to support accountability. Their absence undermines exactly what that system was built to provide, and the framework that should respond to that undermining turns out, on examination, to have been designed for a different problem than the one that is actually here. That gap between the problem that exists and the tools available to address it is where this investigation now sits, and it is a gap that has not yet been formally closed. Not everyone who has examined this pattern arrives at the same interpretation. That is worth stating clearly, and worth taking seriously. The evidence that has been assembled across this investigation, the missing records, the insufficient explanations, the clustering of absences, the circular accountability problem, does not point unanimously in one direction. Different researchers, different archival professionals, and different legal scholars have looked at the same body of evidence and reached different conclusions about what it means. And before this investigation moves any further, those different interpretations deserve to be examined carefully and honestly. This matters for a specific reason. When a pattern is observed that does not have an obvious or simple explanation, there is a tendency, in any investigation, on any subject, to move toward the interpretation that feels most complete, the one that seems to account for the most evidence, that provides the clearest narrative, that gives the pattern the most coherent shape. But that tendency can be misleading. A satisfying interpretation is not the same as a correct one, and in a subject where the available evidence is incomplete and the full picture has not yet been assembled, intellectual honesty requires holding multiple possibilities open, even when some of them are less compelling than others. The first interpretation, and arguably the most widely held among institutional professionals, is that this is primarily a resourcing problem. Archives, on this view, are chronically underfunded institutions operating under conditions that make reliable record maintenance genuinely difficult. Staff numbers are insufficient relative to the volume of material being managed. Systems are outdated, sometimes significantly so. Digital infrastructure that was installed in the 1990s and never adequately updated. Physical storage facilities that were never purpose-built for archival use. Cataloging systems that were created under one set of standards and never fully reconciled with the systems that replaced them. Under these conditions, record loss is not surprising. It is, in a sense, predictable. Some believe this explanation covers the majority of cases, and they make the argument with reference to documented evidence of institutional underfunding across many countries and many decades. Archival institutions rarely attract significant political attention or significant budget allocations. They are not seen as frontline public services. The consequences of inadequate investment in them accumulate slowly and invisibly, until years later, a researcher tries to locate a record that should be there and finds that it is not. On this view, the problem is real, but its cause is mundane, not deliberate, not organized. Simply the predictable result of sustained institutional neglect. But this is where the resourcing explanation encounters a difficulty that its proponents have not fully resolved. Underfunding produces random loss. That is the key point. When an institution lacks the resources to properly manage its holdings, the records that suffer are spread across the full range of what the institution holds. Old records and newer ones. Records on important subjects and records on trivial ones. Records that would matter enormously if they were available, and records that no one would ever seek. The loss is not selective because the cause, inadequate resources, does not discriminate. And yet, as has been documented across the previous chapters of this investigation, the absences being observed do not appear to be random. They cluster. They appear more frequently around certain subjects, certain institutions, and certain time periods than around others. If underfunding were the primary explanation, that clustering would be difficult to account for. The resourcing argument explains why records are lost. It does not explain why particular records are lost at higher rates than others. And it is that second question, the question of distribution, that the resourcing explanation leaves open. Others disagree with the resourcing interpretation on exactly this basis. They acknowledge that underfunding is real and that it contributes to record loss in a general sense. But they argue that it cannot serve as the primary explanation for what is being observed, precisely because of the non-random distribution of the absences. Their position is not that the resourcing problem doesn't exist. It is that the resourcing problem, even at its most severe, would not produce the pattern that has been documented. Something additional is needed to account for why the gaps appear where they appear, and not elsewhere. The second interpretation shifts the focus from resources to process. Specifically, to the periods when record-keeping systems undergo significant change. The argument here is that transitions, from paper to digital, from one departmental structure to another, from one cataloging standard to the next, create conditions in which records are particularly vulnerable. During a transition, established procedures are disrupted. Staff are adapting to new systems, while still managing existing obligations. Records that were properly held under the old system may not be cleanly carried over into the new one. Some fall through procedural gaps that are not immediately visible and only become apparent when someone later tries to retrieve a specific item. This explanation is widely accepted among archival professionals, and it has the advantage of being grounded in documented experience. The challenges of system transitions are well understood in the field. The record of failed or incomplete transitions, instances where information was lost or made inaccessible during the shift from one system to another, is extensive. It does not require unusual circumstances or any action beyond ordinary institutional difficulty. At first, this seems like it might account for a significant portion of what has been observed. Many of the missing records in this investigation date from exactly the transition period of the 1980s through the early 2000s, which aligns with the argument about system change. But there's a problem. The transition explanation, like the resourcing explanation, predicts random loss. Records that fall through procedural cracks during a system transition do so because of the mechanics of the transition, not because of anything specific about the records themselves. And the clustering of absences around particular subjects does not fit what a purely transition-based explanation would predict. Critics of the transition interpretation have raised this point directly. They note that archival professionals who accept the transition explanation tend to apply it at a general level. It accounts for why some records from this period are unavailable, without specifying which records or why particular categories are affected more than others. When pressed on the question of clustering, the transition explanation does not offer a clear answer. It describes a mechanism for loss, but not a mechanism for selective loss. And selectivity is precisely what makes this pattern difficult to explain through process failures alone. The third interpretation is quieter, and it comes from a different kind of source. Some researchers who have spent significant time examining this subject, people who have looked at more cases than most, and who have thought carefully about what the evidence does and does not support, have arrived at a position of deliberate restraint. They argue that the full picture has not yet been assembled, that the data currently available, while suggestive of a pattern, is not comprehensive enough to support any strong conclusion about what the pattern means or what is causing it. This position deserves respect because it is grounded in intellectual honesty rather than convenience. Drawing a strong conclusion from incomplete data is a risk in any investigation. The pattern that has been observed may look different once more cases are documented, once more institutions are examined, once the full distribution of absences across more systems and more time periods becomes clearer. What appears to be a meaningful clustering now might, with more data, turn out to be a feature of which cases happen to attract research attention, not a feature of the underlying reality. And yet this interpretation also has a limitation that is worth naming. The call for more data before drawing conclusions is always reasonable in principle, but it can also function in practice as a reason to defer the question indefinitely. More data can always be gathered. The picture can always be described as not yet complete. If the standard for reaching a conclusion is a level of evidence that may never be fully assembled, given the structural barriers to investigating institutional record loss, then the question may remain formally open not because it is genuinely unresolvable, but because the conditions for resolving it are never met. This raises a question that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of all three interpretations. Each of them explains something. None of them explains everything. The resourcing argument accounts for general record loss, but not for its distribution. The transition argument accounts for timing, but not for selectivity. The data incomplete argument is honest about uncertainty, but does not advance the investigation. And none of the three, individually or in combination, provides a complete account of what has been observed. Some who have examined all three interpretations suggest that the most accurate position may be a combination, that resourcing failures and transition gaps created the conditions in which certain losses became possible, without those factors alone being sufficient to explain the full pattern. What that combination leaves unaccounted for, they acknowledge, remains unclear. That acknowledgement, careful, measured, and honest, may be the closest thing to a consensus position that currently exists among those who have studied this subject seriously. Not a conclusion, not a confirmed explanation, but a shared recognition that the available interpretations, taken together, still leave something unexplained at the center of the pattern. What that something is has not been named, and the fact that it has not been named, that it sits unidentified within a body of evidence that multiple researchers have examined, is perhaps the most significant unresolved point in this entire investigation. There is a particular kind of unresolved question that stays with an investigation long after the research has stopped. Not because the question is dramatic, or because the answer would be world-changing, but because the question is reasonable, because the evidence gathered in pursuit of an answer is real, and documented, and specific, and because the answer, despite all of that, has not arrived. This investigation has reached that point, and it is worth sitting with what has actually been established before acknowledging what remains open. What has been established is this: official records exist, or existed, across a range of institutions, countries, and time periods. Their existence is not a matter of speculation or assumption. They are listed in catalogs. They are referenced in subsequent documents. They are cited in formal proceedings, quoted in official reports, and acknowledged by the institutions that were supposed to maintain them. The paper trail leading toward these records is intact. Researchers can follow it, step by step, through official documentation that confirms the record's creation, receipt, and registration within an institutional system. The existence of these records, at some point in time, is confirmed. What cannot be confirmed, and what has resisted confirmation through every channel of inquiry that has been pursued, is where they went. That is the central question, not a rhetorical question, a factual one. At some point between the moment these records were created and acknowledged, and the moment a researcher or legal professional tried to retrieve them, something happened. The records became unreachable, and the explanation for why they became unreachable has not been provided at a level of detail that satisfies the basic requirements of verification. The explanations that have been offered are familiar by now: administrative transfer, digitization, natural deterioration, each one describing a real process, each one plausible in isolation, each one presented with the confidence of institutional authority. But they do not account for what has actually been observed. They do not explain why the absences cluster the way they do, around specific subjects, specific institutions, specific windows of time, rather than distributing randomly as genuine accidental loss would predict. They do not explain why follow-up requests, submitted through formal channels with legal standing, so frequently go unanswered, and they do not explain why, in case after case, the inquiry stops, not because it was resolved, but because the mechanisms available for pursuing it further ran out before the question did. What remains, after all of that, is a gap, not a metaphorical gap, a specific, documentable space between what the official record says should exist and what can actually be found and verified. On one side of that gap is the catalog entry, the citation, the formal acknowledgement, the institutional confirmation that a record was there. On the other side is the empty space where the record should be, and the unanswered question of what filled the distance between the two. This gap has not been formally studied at the scale it appears to exist. That is a significant observation on its own. The pattern being described in this investigation, a pattern of non-random absence, of unreachable records, of explanations that do not hold under scrutiny, is not something that has been assembled by a well-funded, institutionally supported research program. It has been pieced together by individual researchers, often working independently, often without access to the resources that would allow them to examine the pattern at the breadth and depth it deserves. Their findings have been published, noted, and in some cases discussed in academic and professional circles, but they have not triggered the kind of formal, systematic, well-resourced investigation that the consistency and scale of the pattern would seem to warrant. No international body has mapped it. That is worth pausing on. There are international bodies that track a remarkable range of institutional failures, corruption indices, press freedom rankings, judicial independence assessments, public health compliance monitoring. The architecture for international institutional oversight exists and is regularly applied to problems considered significant enough to warrant it. And yet the specific question of why official records go missing in patterns that do not match accidental loss, and what the consequences of those absences are for accountability, for legal rights, and for historical understanding, has not been taken up by any body with the mandate and resources to examine it comprehensively. No government has commissioned a formal review of it. This is also notable. Governments regularly commission reviews of institutional failures when those failures attract sufficient attention. Inquiries are established. Independent investigators are appointed. Reports are produced. The machinery for formal institutional review exists in most functioning democracies, and it is deployed when a problem is considered significant enough to require it. But the problem described in this investigation, the systematic unavailability of records that should exist, following patterns that the standard explanations cannot account for, has not, to date, been the subject of that kind of formal governmental attention. and the researchers who have pointed to it publicly have largely done so without institutional support. They have raised the question in academic papers, in journalism, in professional conferences. They have documented individual cases, compared notes with colleagues, and identified the pattern carefully and responsibly. But they have done so as individuals, without the institutional backing, the formal mandate, or the resources that would allow the investigation to be conducted at the scale the problem appears to require. Their work is real and it is valuable, but it is not the same as a formal, systematic inquiry, and it has not produced the same kind of institutional response. This raises a question that may be the most important one this investigation has encountered. It is not a complicated question. It is actually quite simple. If these records are simply lost, if the explanation is genuinely one of administrative failure, inadequate resources, system transition gaps, and accumulated institutional inefficiency, then the problem, while serious, is in principle solvable. Better systems can be built, more resources can be allocated, stronger accountability frameworks can be designed and implemented, standards can be raised and consistently applied. The problem would be real and its consequences would be significant, but the path toward addressing it would be clear. It would require investment and political will, but it would not require anything beyond what institutions are known to be capable of. But this is where the question becomes more difficult, because the evidence assembled across this investigation does not fully fit the picture of simple, accidental, evenly distributed loss. The clustering of absences, the non-response to formal inquiries, the unavailability of records that were demonstrably in use before they became unreachable, the circular accountability structure that makes investigation nearly impossible. These are features of the problem that a resource and process explanation does not adequately account for. And if the explanation is something other than simple loss, something that has not yet been formally named, something that the existing frameworks for thinking about institutional record-keeping were not designed to identify or address, then the implications extend beyond the records themselves. Because if the explanation has not been named, it is also missing. And that means there are two absences at the center of this problem, not one. There is the absence of the records, and there is the absence of a credible, verified, complete explanation for where they went. Both are real. Both have consequences, and neither has been resolved. It doesn't fully make sense that a problem of this apparent consistency and scale, affecting multiple institutions across multiple countries over multiple decades, producing consequences for legal rights, historical accountability, and institutional transparency, would remain without formal investigation. The absence of that investigation is itself something worth noting, not as a conclusion about why it hasn't happened, but as an observable fact that sits alongside all the other observable facts in this case. Some believe the answer will eventually emerge, that as more researchers document more cases, as the pattern becomes harder to ignore at a policy level, and as the consequences for real people become more visible, the formal investigation will follow. That the question is not permanently unanswerable. It simply hasn't been answered yet. Others are less certain. They point to the structural barriers that have been described throughout this investigation, the circular accountability problem, the inadequacy of existing legal frameworks, the absence of any body with both the mandate and the resources to examine the pattern systematically. These barriers do not resolve themselves automatically. They require deliberate action to overcome. And deliberate action requires someone, some institution, some authority, some body with sufficient standing, to decide that this question matters enough to pursue seriously. That decision has not yet been made. The question has not yet been taken up at the level it appears to require. And so the investigation ends where it began, not with an answer, but with the question still standing, documented, specific, real, and unresolved. The official records exist, or existed. That much is certain. Where they went is not. And between those two facts, the confirmed existence and the unexplained absence, is a space that has not yet been filled with anything that fully holds up under examination. That space is where the answer should be. And the fact that it remains empty, after everything that has been examined here, is perhaps the most important thing this investigation has found.